The first thing you noticed, driving east on County Road 14 in July of 1988, was the color of the corn, or rather, the absence of it. For as far as the eye could follow the flat ribbon of blacktop, past the Weaver spread with its 8,000 acres of hybridized DeKalb seed, past the Lundgren place, past the old Hensley farm that had changed hands 3 times in 5 years. The fields had gone the color of old newspaper. The stalks stood at half their proper height, curled inward on themselves like arthritic fingers, their tassels brown and brittle before they'd even had a chance to shed their pollen. The ground between the rows had cracked into a jigsaw puzzle of hardpan, each piece curled slightly upward at the edges, as if the earth itself were trying to peel away from everything beneath it. The sky above was a hard, pale blue, not the soft summer blue that belonged over Nebraska in July, but a bleached, merciless white blue that had no intention of producing a cloud. The radio in every farm truck, every grain elevator office, every chrome-railed diner stool from the Missouri River to the Colorado border said the same thing that summer. Worst drought since the Dust Bowl. The Farmer's Almanac, which a good many of the older farmers in the valley had been quietly consulting since February, the way their fathers had done and their grandfathers before them, had said something similar in language less dramatic but no less certain. The meteorologists on the evening news in Omaha and Lincoln spoke of a stubborn high-pressure ridge parked over the central continent like an uninvited guest who had overstayed his welcome by 6 months. The corn needed 14 inches of rain between May and August. The valley had received 4. But if you drove far enough east on County Road 14, past the last of the Weaver pivots, their aluminum arms now motionless and useless, their sprinkler heads dry as old bones, past the roadside ditch where Plum Creek had been reduced to a chain of muddy green puddles connected by nothing at all, you came to a place where the color of the land changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the shocking green of an irrigated golf course dropped into a desert. It was quieter than that, and more honest. It was the deep, dusty green of corn that had grown according to its own unhurried schedule, in ground that had been rested and prepared and respected over many decades. The stalks were not the 8-foot giants that Gordon Weaver's Pioneer hybrid seed had promised on its bags. They were shorter, stockier, with leaves that had rolled slightly inward to conserve moisture during the worst weeks, then opened again when the morning dew provided what the sky would not. But they were alive. Unmistakably, stubbornly, quietly alive. Standing at the edge of his east field that morning, Silas Holt watched the sun come up over the cottonwood brake he'd planted with his father in 1949, and he listened to the windmill. It was still making the same sound it had made his entire life. That slow, syncopated creak and groan, the wheel turning in the southeast breeze that came up most mornings off the Republican River drainage, the sucker rod working up and down in the casing, and the water, cold, clear, tasting faintly of iron and deep rock, spilling into the galvanized stock tank and running in a thin, bright rivulet toward the base of his garden. The windmill was a 1937 Aermotor, the standard model, manufactured in Chicago and shipped by rail to the grain elevator in town, where his father Earl had picked it up in the bed of a borrowed flatbed. It had been erected in the spring of that year by Earl and 2 of his neighbors, standing on a wooden platform built from hand-hewn lumber, and in the 51 years since, it had never stopped working for more than a few days at a stretch. Silas was 71 years old. He had been watching that windmill his entire life. He was not a tall man. He had been. Once, his Army discharge papers from 1945 listed him at 6 feet and 1 inch, but the decades of field work had compressed something in his spine, and now he stood slightly hunched, with the particular forward lean of a man who has spent more of his waking hours looking at the ground than at the horizon. His hands were the size of fielder's gloves, brown and cracked at every knuckle, with nails permanently dark at their edges regardless of how hard he scrubbed them. He wore the same thing he had worn to work every day for 40 years, dark denim Wrangler jeans, a chambray work shirt in either blue or a faded blue-green, suspenders because belts had always struck him as insufficient, and a sweat-stained cat diesel power cap that had been white once and was now the color of old ivory. He did not talk much. He had never talked much, and the people who had known him longest, the men at the co-op, the woman behind the counter at the feed store, the pastor at the Methodist church he attended every other Sunday, had long since learned that this was not unfriendliness. It was simply that Silas Holt operated on a different economy of words than most people. He said what needed to be said. He left the rest alone. This morning, like every morning, he said nothing at all. He stood at the edge of his field, thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and he looked at his corn, and he listened to the windmill. And somewhere behind his pale gray eyes, behind the weathered stillness of his face, he was doing the kind of arithmetic that has no numbers in it. The slow, continuous calculation of a man who has spent 70 years watching the same piece of ground and learning its moods the way other men learn the moods of their wives and children. He knew the corn would make it. He had known since May. He was less certain about the valley. The Holt family had been farming the same 160 acres in Harlan County since 1902, when Silas's grandfather, Clarence Holt, had proved up his homestead claim under the terms of the original act. Clarence had come from Ohio with a wife, 3 children, a team of matched Percheron draft horses, and a cast-iron stubbornness that his descendants would recognize in themselves for the next 4 generations. He had broken the ground with a walking plow. He had built his first house from sod and replaced it with frame lumber when the railroad came through. He had watched his neighbors' farms blow away in the 1890s drought, and he had learned something from that. The land would tell you what it needed, if you were willing to shut up and listen. Earl Holt, Silas's father, had inherited the farm in 1931, 2 years into the Depression and 4 years before the worst of the Dust Bowl. He had grown up hearing his father talk about the dry years, and he had listened in a way that many of his generation, convinced by the long prosperity of the early 20th century that the bad times were anomalies rather than promises, had not. He had planted shelter belts of cottonwood and Osage orange along the north and west edges of the property, the way the government men said to do, and then more beyond that. He had started resting his fields, taking 1/4 of the farm out of production every year and letting it lie fallow, building organic matter, rebuilding moisture reserves deep in the soil profile. He had maintained the crop rotation his father had used: corn 1 year, oats the next, then a legume, clover or alfalfa, in the 3rd year to put nitrogen back into the ground. He had never once planted corn in the same field 2 years running. Earl Holt was not a man anyone would have called a visionary. He was a man who got up before daylight and went to bed after dark, who kept his tools clean and his fences tight, who paid his debts on time and expected others to do the same, and who regarded the land not as a resource to be leveraged, but as a responsibility held in trust, entrusted to him by his father and, through him, to whoever would come after. These were not ideas he had arrived at through reading or reflection. They were ideas he had absorbed through his skin, through his hands, through the specific education of watching the same ground through dry years and wet years and catastrophic years and redemptive ones. His wife, Edna, kept a kitchen garden that fed the family through every difficulty the county had thrown at them since 1931. His barn held 6 good milk cows, a team of horses that he kept alongside his first tractor, a Farmel F-20 purchased used in 1936, because horses ate grass and tractors ate fuel, and in a year when the cash was short, grass was free. He laid a root cellar under the back addition of the house in 1938, lined with fieldstone and stocked every fall with potatoes and turnips and canned goods put up by Edna in quart mason jars that lined the shelves like a different kind of bank account. The valley had not always been a place of competing ambitions. It had been, through the 1940s and the 1950s, a place of modest operations that knew their scale. Farms of 160 to 320 acres, most of them family-run, most of them carrying little or no debt after the Depression, had driven out those who had borrowed too freely in the 20s. The neighbors traded labor at harvest time. They shared equipment, a threshing ring that went from farm to farm in August, the same machine doing the same work for everyone in turn. They met at the Grange Hall on Tuesday evenings in winter, and the women organized the church suppers, and the children went to the consolidated school in Keene Falls on a yellow bus that stopped at every mailbox on County Road 14. The diner, Marlene's Place, which had been Clifford's Place before that and the Valley Cafe before that, had red vinyl stools along a Formica counter, and a pie case with 4 kinds of pie rotating by the day, and a coffee urn that was refilled from a percolator that ran from 5 in the morning until the last customer left. The men came in their work clothes. The talk was about weather and prices and equipment and the general reliability or unreliability of the world, and it was conducted in a register that was neither cheerful nor despairing, but steady, a practical, daily reckoning with the condition of things. When someone had a bad year, the table knew about it and said nothing directly, which was its own kind of solidarity. Silas had sat at that counter, on the same stool 2 seats from the end, since he was old enough to drive himself to town. His father had sat in the same place before him. Silas had brought his wife Ruth to the counter on their second date in 1943, before he shipped out, and after he came back in 1945, he had brought her again, and it had become their Saturday morning ritual for 37 years, until Ruth's heart gave out in February of 1982, and he came alone after that. He still sat in the same place. He still ordered coffee, black, and sometimes the apple pie. He left $1.02 on the counter and walked out the same way he'd always walked out, and the people who had known him since boyhood thought nothing of it, and the newer residents of the county thought he was simply one of those old men who moved through the world in ways that no longer quite touched it. They were wrong about that. But the correction was coming, and it was not the kind anyone would have chosen. On a shelf above the kitchen table in the farmhouse, next to the farmer's almanac for the current year and the 3 years before it, Silas kept the battered tin box that had once held Prince Albert pipe tobacco. Inside the box were seeds. They were corn seeds, open-pollinated, meaning they would breed true from year to year, meaning you could save them from the previous harvest and plant them next spring and get the same corn your grandfather had planted. They were a variety that had no commercial name, only the name the Holt family had given it, Holt Flint. It was a flower corn with deep yellow kernels, developed over several generations of selective breeding from a mix of Reed's yellow dent and an older gourd seed variety that Clarence Holt had traded for with a Pawnee man he'd met at the feed store in 1907. The ears were not large, nothing like the big, blocky ears you got from Pioneer hybrid or DeKalb hybrid varieties. But the roots went down like a fist, punching through caliche and clay and gravel to find water 6, 7, 8 feet below the surface. In a dry year, when hybrid varieties were giving up by August, Holt Flint was still pulling moisture from depths the Extension Office didn't account for in its soil moisture estimates. The extension agent, a young man from Lincoln named Brad Kowalski who had been assigned to Harlan County in 1983, had visited Silas's farm once, in the spring of 1985, as part of his outreach rounds. He had stood in the seed corn shed looking at the open-pollinated seed with a polite expression that failed to conceal his bewilderment. "You know," he had said, in the careful tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone elderly, "Pioneer's new 3737 hybrid has documented yield advantages of 30 to 40% over open-pollinated varieties in test plots at the university. Under optimal conditions." Silas had looked at him for a moment. "Under optimal conditions," he repeated. "Yes, sir. When's the last time you had optimal conditions?" Brad Kowalski had made a note on his clipboard and moved on to the Weaver operation, where Gordon had welcomed him with coffee and a tour of his new center pivot system, and where the conversation had been, by all measures, much more productive. What Brad Kowalski had not lingered long enough to learn about was the well. In the northeast corner of the home quarter, beneath a cap of solid limestone, there was a formation that the county well driller, a man named Voss who drove a cable tool rig behind a 1929 International truck, had called a pressure zone when he'd sunk the original casing in 1937. The water down there was confined between 2 layers of impermeable rock, squeezed by the weight of everything above it, and it would rise on its own in the casing without pumping. In a true artesian well, the water would flow right at the surface. This one came up to within 60 feet of the top and stayed there, regardless of the season, regardless of the drought, regardless of how many times the windmill lifted it out and into the tank. Voss had told Earl Holt to go deeper than he needed to, an extra 40 feet past the water-bearing zone. "This water's been down there since before your grandfather's grandfather was born," Voss had said, chewing a toothpick on the running board of his truck. "It ain't going anywhere. But you give her room, she'll treat you right." Earl had gone the extra 40 feet. In 1988, the well was at the same level it had been in 1937. In 1956, when the last serious drought had gripped the region and several of the neighboring farms had lost their shallow wells completely, the Holt well had not changed by a foot. It tapped a confined formation that recharged slowly, glacially, from the hill country 50 miles to the west, from snowmelt and deep seepage that had been making the same quiet underground journey for longer than any record measured. It was not connected to the shallow alluvial aquifer that the rest of the valley's wells had been drawing from. It was a different body of water entirely. Older, deeper, and as far removed from the frenzy of center-pivot irrigation as the moon is from a stock pond. The air motor on its tower had one job: to lift that water to the surface whenever the wind blew, which in Nebraska was most of the time. It had no electric motor, no control panel, no breaker box, no monthly bill. It needed grease on the gearbox twice a year and occasional attention to the leather pump cups and the connecting rods, and in return it worked without complaint or drama, day and night, in every season. Earl Holt had understood, the way men of that generation understood things that they could not necessarily articulate, that the reliability of the simple was worth more than the power of the complicated, particularly when the complicated broke down and there was no one nearby who knew how to fix it. Silas had maintained the windmill the way his father had maintained it before him, with the same tools, the same grease gun, the same willingness to climb the tower in any weather when the sound changed and something needed attention. The tower itself was original galvanized steel from the Aermotor Company of Chicago, and it showed its age, the paint long gone, the metal going to a brown-gray that was not quite rust and not quite steel, but the engineering beneath the weathering was sound, and there was something in its continued turning that had come to feel, to Silas, less like mechanics than like breath. Gordon Weaver had arrived in the valley in 1973, the year Earl Butz, Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, had made his famous and fateful pronouncement, "Get big or get out." Gordon was 33 that year, freshly graduated from the University of Nebraska with a degree in agricultural business management, armed with a philosophy that the old farmers of the valley regarded with a mixture of admiration and unease. He had come from eastern Nebraska, from a family that had farmed in a modest, traditional way, and he had decided somewhere in his junior year of college that modest and traditional were synonyms for poor and behind the times. He had purchased the old Hensley farm for 180 acres, good ground on the lower valley, with an FHA loan and money borrowed from his father-in-law, and he had set to work. He was not a lazy man. That was what people said about him. Even later, even after everything had come undone, Gordon Weaver worked harder than almost anyone in the county. He was in his truck before daylight and back after dark, and he knew his fields, and he was genuinely gifted at the business end of agriculture. He understood commodity markets, futures contracts, price hedging. He read the trade publications religiously. He attended every conference and field day the Extension Service offered. He was the kind of man who, in a different context, would have been considered admirable in every particular. The 1970s were good years to be aggressive. The Soviets had secretly negotiated a massive grain purchase from American dealers in 1972, what the newspapers later called the Great Grain Robbery, and corn and soybean prices had shot upward like a skyrocket. Earl Butz was on every agricultural radio program in the country, telling farmers to plant fence to fence, to borrow money, to expand, to modernize. The USDA's projections showed a world that would need more food every year, forever, and commodity prices that would never seriously decline. The banks agreed enthusiastically. First Agricultural Bank of Keene Falls, the county bank, the same one Silas's father had dealt with since the 1930s, was falling over itself to make production loans in those years. Farmland values were going up every season. A man could borrow against his equity, use that money to buy more land, watch the new land appreciate, borrow against that, and buy more. Gordon Weaver understood this geometry instinctively, and he wrote it with both hands. By 1978, he owned or was buying on contract nearly 3,000 acres of valley farmland. He had purchased a John Deere 4430 tractor, a hulking, cab-equipped machine with air conditioning and an AM/FM radio that cost more than most men in the valley had spent on their entire farms, and followed it with a 6,600 combine, an 8-row corn planter, and a 12-bottom moldboard plow. He had put in the first center-pivot irrigation system in the county, a Valley brand, quarter-mile arm, capable of covering 130 acres in a single rotation, drawing from a 6-inch well casing and a 50-horsepower electric submersible pump that moved water at 1,000 gallons per minute. The system was a marvel. There was no other word for it. The first time Silas saw the center pivot operating, he had stopped his old Farmel M at the edge of the road and watched for a long time, the engine idling, one elbow out the window. The machine was genuinely impressive, you had to grant it that. A slow procession of aluminum pipe sections supported on wheeled towers, it moved in a great circle around the well at its center, driven by small electric motors, spraying a fine mist of groundwater across the crops in a perfect arc. From the air, and Gordon had paid a crop duster's pilot to photograph it from his Cessna, it made a circle of green visible for miles. Gordon had framed that photograph and hung it in his office, next to his university diploma and a laminated placard bearing the Earl But's quote, which he had clipped from a trade journal and found genuinely inspiring. Silas watched the pivot for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he put the Farmel in gear and drove on. That fall, at the co-op elevator where both men sold grain, Gordon had swung his truck in alongside Silas's and leaned out the window with the easy confidence of a man who has just made money. "You see my new pivot, Holt?" "I saw it. Pulled 210 bushels to the acre this year." "You." 94, Silas said. Gordon laughed, not unkindly, but with the amusement of a man who has found the confirmation he was looking for. 94. "Hell, Silas, you're leaving 116 bushels on the table every single acre. You know what that's worth at today's prices." Silas loaded his grain ticket carefully into his shirt pocket. "I know what it costs to grow," he said. He drove away, and Gordon watched him go, shaking his head slowly, still smiling. What Gordon Weaver did not calculate, in the autumn of 1978, was what it cost per bushel to pump water from 500 feet down with a 50-horsepower electric motor, factor in the diesel to run the center pivot's generator on the days when the power was out, amortize the $87,000 capital cost of the system, and add that to his operating loan interest at 12% annually. He was running closer to break-even than his yield numbers suggested. But the land values kept rising, and the banker kept calling him a success, and he kept expanding. In 1979, Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to fight inflation, and by 1981 the prime rate had reached 21.5%. If you want to understand what that number meant to a farmer operating on borrowed money, consider this. Gordon Weaver's outstanding operating and real estate loans at the beginning of 1981 totaled something in excess of $2 million. At 21%, the annual interest alone on that debt exceeded $400,000. The gross revenue of his farm in a normal year was somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000. By the time he paid his inputs, seed, fertilizer, chemicals, fuel, equipment maintenance, irrigation energy costs, he was left with a margin the interest was eating alive. He was not alone. Every aggressive farmer in the county was in the same box. The First Agricultural Bank of Keene Falls had extended itself nearly as badly as its customers, and the bank examiners from Lincoln were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Farmland values, which had been the collateral for all this borrowing, had peaked in 1981 and were beginning to slip, slowly at first, then faster, then in a way that made grown men feel sick to their stomachs in the night. The Farm Aid concert in September of 1985, Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp and Neil Young singing for farmers in a stadium in Illinois, broadcast on ABC, was not, for most of the men sitting in Marlene's diner in Keene Falls, an abstraction. Dub Pickens, who had been farming his place since 1958, held his coffee cup in both hands and watched the television above the counter and didn't say anything for a long time. His wife had cried when Willie Nelson played on the road again, which didn't seem right for the occasion but was, in some way he couldn't name, entirely right. A man at the far end of the counter set down his fork and stared at his eggs and said, very quietly, "Hell of a thing," and no one disputed it. Gordon Weaver had refinanced twice by 1985. He had sold his John Deere 4430 and bought a 4640, a bigger tractor, not a smaller one, because the new hydraulic system was more efficient, and efficiency was how you survived. He had expanded his center pivot system to cover 320 acres of the best ground, adding a second well and a second pump. He had switched his entire acreage to Pioneer 3737 hybrid corn because the test plot data supported it. His banker, Carl Brennan at First Agricultural, had approved all of it, because the alternative was to acknowledge that the loans already made were in worse shape than the paperwork showed. and neither man was quite ready for that conversation. Silas Holt watched all of this from the same 160 acres he had always farmed. What he did, in the years between 1981 and 1987, was what he had always done. He planted Holt Flint on a 3-year rotation, resting one field, planting one to oats and clover, and putting the third into corn. He put up his own hay for the 27 Angus cross cows he kept, selling calves every fall. He maintained his equipment, the old Farmall M he'd had since the 1950s, and a 1968 John Deere 4020 that was the newest tractor on the place, with the kind of patient, ongoing attention that kept machinery running for decades past its expected life. He ran no operating loans. He had paid off the last of his land debt in 1971. He owed the bank nothing. He had never owed the bank nothing in such a way that it felt like an achievement. It was simply the condition he had maintained with the same quiet consistency with which he maintained everything else. The year Ruth died, February of 1982, her heart simply stopping one morning between getting up and making coffee. As if it had decided it had done its work, he had sat in the kitchen for a long time after the ambulance left, and then he had gone out and done the chores, because the cows needed feeding and the windmill needed checking after a cold night. Ruth would have understood that. She had understood most things about him. In 1982, when a reporter from the Lincoln Journal came out to write a feature on the farm crisis in Harlan County, she had spent 2 days with Gordon Weaver, photographing his pivots and his machinery and his charts, and then driven by Silas's place and slowed down, and then kept driving, because there wasn't much there that looked like a story. The windmill turning in the afternoon breeze. The small green fields, neat and quiet. An old man in a chambray shirt walking the fence line. Not much of a story. The next year, Gordon bought another 800 acres from the Lundgren family, who were getting out. He was now operating over 4,000 acres. He had 5 center pivot systems. He had 3 full-time hired men and a bookkeeper who came in twice a week. He had a Motorola mobile phone installed in his truck, one of the early car phones, the kind in a leather case bolted under the dash, and he used it to call his commodity broker in Omaha. The phone was a marvel, too, in its way. You could call Omaha from your truck, from the middle of a cornfield. People came to look at it. On a fall afternoon in 1986, Gordon stopped his truck at the end of Silas's lane, the big double-cab Ford F-350 diesel, dark blue with Gordon Weaver's Sons Farming painted on the door in gold lettering. Though Gordon's sons were both in college and rarely came home to farm, and leaned out the window. "Silas, I've been meaning to ask, why in the hell do you still use that thing?" He nodded toward the air motor. He was not being cruel. He seemed genuinely curious. "I can get you a quote on a 3-inch submersible pump. Put it on that good well of yours. Hook it to the grid. You'd have 10 times the water delivery for a fraction of the—" "It works," Silas said. "It works." Gordon repeated it the way you'd repeat something a child had said. "Silas, efficiency. It worked in 56. It worked in 74. It works when the power's out." Silas looked at the windmill, then back at Gordon. "How many horsepower does the wind cost?" Gordon opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he said, "Fair enough," and drove away. He told the story at the diner the next morning and got a good laugh from the table. But there was something in the laugh that was not entirely comfortable. In February of 1988, Silas read the Farmer's Almanac and then spent 3 evenings going through the meteorological records he kept in a composition book in the kitchen. Daily temperature and precipitation data, cloud descriptions, wind direction, going back to 1953, when he'd started keeping the records himself, supplemented by his father's earlier notebooks in the same drawer. He was looking for patterns. What he saw concerned him. The winter had been too warm and too dry. The January thaw had come 3 weeks early, and then the cold had returned without moisture. The snowpack in the watershed to the west, the Republican River Basin, was 30% of normal. He walked his fields in late February and pushed a soil probe down to 3 feet and looked at what came up, rubbing it between his fingers with the concentration of a doctor palpating a patient's abdomen. Deep in his chest, something quiet and experienced said, "Dry year." In March, he did several things. He pulled out his best seed corn, the Holt Flint he'd selected carefully from the previous year's harvest, choosing the ears from the plants that had done best in the dry stretch of late August, and spread it on the kitchen table under a gooseneck lamp and sorted it by hand, discarding anything that didn't feel right. He increased the proportion of his acreage going to fallow this year, taking 40 acres out of production entirely and planting it to a mix of cowpeas and sorghum Sudan that he would disc under green to add organic matter and hold moisture. He pushed his planting date back 2 weeks from his normal schedule, waiting for the soil temperature at 4 inches to reach 60 degrees rather than the 55 that was generally considered acceptable, because he wanted the seed in warm ground that would support quick germination with minimal moisture waste. He also had Orville Voss, the son of the original well driller, now running the family business at 62, come out and inspect the artesian while casing and the pump rods on the air motor. Orville lowered a weighted measuring tape and called up the number. 61 feet to water, he said. Same as always, Silas said. Same as always. Orville wound up the tape. You know Gordon Weaver's been drilling new wells. Added 2 more last year. I know. He's down to 480 feet on his newest one. Pumps pulling at close to capacity to maintain pressure. Orville looked at the air motor. Its wheel turning slowly in the March wind. This one's not going anywhere, Silas. This one's in a different formation. You got a confined aquifer down there. Recharges from the hill country 50 miles west. Takes 100 years to cycle through. I know, Silas said. Orville looked at him. You know Gordon's new pivots are drawing from the same shallow formation as the Lundgren well that went dry in 56. Silas said nothing. He looked west, toward the hill country, which was invisible beyond the horizon but present in his mind the way things you've known since childhood are present even when you can't see them. Dry year coming? Orville asked. Could be, Silas said. In April, he planted his corn in ground that had been prepared the previous fall with deep moldboard plowing to break the hardpan and allow moisture penetration. He planted at a lower population than the Extension Service recommended, 22,000 seeds per acre rather than 32,000, because in a dry year, lower population meant less competition for soil moisture among the plants, and each plant would build a larger, deeper root system. He planted in rows 30 inches apart rather than the modern 36-inch standard, because the narrower rows would shade the ground sooner and reduce evaporation. He was using techniques his father had taught him, some of which appeared in no university extension bulletin published after 1965. On the 15th of April, he ran the air motor's output through a check valve and into the buried clay pipe that his father had laid in the 1940s. A gravity irrigation system that carried water from the stock tank down to the lower field in a slow, steady seep, keeping the root zone moist without waterlogging the surface. Across the county, the pivot irrigation systems were running full bore, trying to compensate for the lack of spring rain. The deep well pumps were humming around the clock. The power company posted record electrical usage for agricultural accounts in March, and again in April. The county aquifer, the shallow one, the one that most of the valley's newer wells were drawing from, was at its lowest spring level in recorded history. June of 1988 was hot and airless and without rain. By the end of the month, the temperature had exceeded 90 degrees for 22 consecutive days. The corn in the valley was at knee height, a good 8 inches below where it should have been, and the ground between the rows was already showing the first cracks. The pivot systems were running continuously, day and night, their electric meters spinning at a rate that made the hired men nervous, and the corn under them was surviving, but not thriving, drawing down the shallow aquifer with every revolution of the aluminum arms. At Marlene's Diner in Keene Falls, the conversation had a quality that Silas recognized from his father's accounts of 1936, a kind of forced cheerfulness undercut by a low hum of fear. The talk moved in circles, each circuit a little tighter than the last. She'll break, Dub Pickens said one morning, stirring sugar into his coffee. Always does. We'll get a good rain in August. What if we don't? Said the man next to him. A younger farmer named Kester who had bought into the valley in 1981 with a substantial operating loan and had been watching his well levels with increasing anxiety. We'll get a rain in August, Dub said, more firmly. Gordon Weaver sat at the end of the counter with his mobile phone on the Formica beside his coffee cup, calling his broker in Omaha between bites of toast. He was hedging his position on corn futures, which had moved up sharply as the drought became national news. Dan Rather was talking about it on the CBS Evening News, which meant it had crossed from agricultural story to American story, and that was both a crisis and an opportunity, if you were positioned correctly. Gordon had run the numbers on his yellow legal pad and concluded that even with a 30% yield reduction, If corn went to $3 a bushel, he would come out ahead. He had also done what every other large operation in the valley had done: increased his pump discharge rate and run his pivots at maximum speed, trying to push as much water as possible through the root zones while there was still water to push. Silas Holt came in for coffee on Tuesdays and Saturdays, as he always had. He sat in the same seat, drank his coffee black, and listened to the talk. "How's your corn looking, Silas?" Kester asked him one Tuesday in early July. "Fair," Silas said. "Just fair. Fair for what's been asked of it." He left $1 on the counter and walked out, and the men at the counter watched him go, and no one said anything for a moment. In the third week of July, the shallow aquifer gave up. It didn't happen all at once. Nothing in nature does. It happened pump by pump, well by well, the way a candle burns down, losing brightness so gradually you don't notice until you're suddenly in the dark. Gordon Weaver's southernmost well, the shallowest of his 5, at 380 feet, drawing from the same productive zone that had watered the valley since settlement, was the first to show the sign. The discharge pressure dropped. Then the volume dropped. The hired man monitoring the pivot systems called the house at 6 in the morning and said south pivot was running rough. Gordon drove out in his truck and got there just as the pump began pulling air. The delivery pipe coughed. Then it ran brown. Then a thin slurry of sand and clay spat from the sprinkler heads, falling on the corn leaves with a soft, terrible hiss. Then nothing. Gordon stood next to the pump house with his hands in his pockets, looking at the pivot arm, still turning, driven by its little electric motors, cycling through its programmed arc, and watched it throw no water. The arm moved in its great circle with the same mechanical patience it always had, obedient to the timer in the control box, performing the perfect geometry of irrigation over rows of corn that were dying. He called the well service company. They came out that afternoon and dropped a camera down the casing. The water table in the formation had dropped below the pump intake. They could lower the pump another 50 feet, for a price, but there was no guarantee it would reach water. The formation itself was being drawn down by the simultaneous pumping of every other large operation in the valley that had tapped the same zone. Each pump making its demand, each demand reducing what was available to the others, all of them drawing from the same account with no deposits being made. The second well went within a week. Then the third. The 2 deepest wells held on through July. But Gordon's corn was already in trouble. The pivots had kept the fields barely alive through June, but the plants had never built the deep root systems they needed, because the surface had always been wet enough that there was no incentive for the roots to go searching. The roots had grown where the water was, near the surface, in the upper 20 inches, reaching sideways rather than down. When the pivot water stopped, those roots reached and found a dry zone from the surface down to 60 feet that the shallow irrigation had never encouraged them to penetrate. The deep reserves that might have saved them had never been tapped, because the roots had never needed to go looking. Gordon's corn began to die on a Tuesday. By Saturday of the same week, the fields that the pivots had kept green all June were as brown as the dryland fields that had never been irrigated at all. The expensive ears, full of pioneer hybrid genetics, optimized for high yield under optimal conditions, had never filled. The kernels were small, incomplete, the product of a plant that had put all its energy into growing tall and fast and dependent, and had nothing left for the hard work of drought. 8,000 acres of the finest commercial hybrid seed in Nebraska, tended with every technological advantage the era could provide, dying in the August heat with a gray and undignified finality. The neighbors' operations were no different. Kester's pivots went dry in the second week of August. The Strickland Place, formerly Hensley, now owned by an Omaha investment partnership that had never intended to farm it themselves, had been running on leased pivot equipment over the same aquifer, and when the water stopped, there was nobody on the ground who had any interest in problem solving. They called their lawyer in Omaha. The lawyer called Carl Brennan at First Agricultural. Carl Brennan had been making calls of his own. Carl Brennan drove County Road 14 on a Tuesday in mid-August, making calls. He had been doing it for 3 days. His secretary back at the bank in Keene Falls had a list. The Kester Farm, 2,200 acres, for $100,000 in operating debt, crop failure. The conversation had taken 40 minutes and left both men feeling like something had been broken that could not be easily fixed. Kester's wife had come in near the end, standing in the kitchen doorway, and she had not said anything, and Carl had not been able to look at her. The Strickland place. The Omaha investor's attorney had already sent a letter. That one was going to be straightforward in the legal sense and terrible in every other sense. 3 more operations after that, each with its own specific variation of the same basic story. Borrowed too much, too fast. Promised the sky by the institutions, the banks, the USDA, the University Extension Service, the implement dealers, the seed companies, that were now not answering their phones or answering them with lawyers. By Tuesday afternoon, Carl Brennan had driven east on County Road 14 to the end of the foreclosure list, and he found that he was at the boundary of Silas Holt's place. He stopped the car. He didn't have business here. Silas owed the bank nothing, had owed it nothing for 17 years. But Carl sat for a moment with the engine running, looking at the thing that had made him stop without quite deciding to. The corn. It was not tall corn. It was not the spectacle that Gordon Weaver's fields had been in a good year, when you could drive the road with your window down and hear the corn growing, the rustle and tick of 8-foot plants in the breeze. Silas's corn was 5 feet tall, maybe a touch more, with ears that were. Carl got out of the car and walked to the fence. The ears were there, fully formed, silk-dried and brown at the tips, meaning the pollination was complete. The ear was filled. He reached over the wire fence and peeled back the husk of the nearest ear and looked at the kernels, tight-packed, deep yellow, hard as small stones. He replaced the husk carefully, the way you'd cover up something private. He looked down the row, perhaps 200 yards of it, and every single plant had an ear. Not a big ear, but there. He looked at the next row. The same. He looked at the field to his left, behind the fence. The same. Then he looked past the fields to the northeast corner of the property, where the old Aermotor Windmill stood on its tower, its 8-foot wheel turning in the afternoon breeze with that familiar slow-motion grace. Even from here he could hear it, barely, over the sound of his car engine, the ancient, rhythmic creak of the sucker rod. And at the base of the tower, a thin stream of water running from the stock tank overflow, wetting the ground in a dark stain that caught the afternoon light like a signature. Carl Brennan stood at the fence for a long time. Then he got back in his car and sat. The list on his secretary's desk had 14 operations on it. He had visited all 14. 13 of them were going to be foreclosed, or were in the process of being foreclosed, or were going to require loan restructuring so significant it amounted to foreclosure in slow motion. One of them, this one, Silas Holt's 160 acres, did not appear on the list at all. Had never appeared on any list of distressed loans in Carl Brennan's 22 years at the bank. He thought about that for a while. Then he started the car and drove back toward town. He stopped at Marlene's for coffee on the way. The diner was quiet at 4 in the afternoon, between the breakfast and supper crowds. Marlene refilled his cup without being asked and went back to folding napkins at the far end of the counter. Silas Holt was in the corner booth, eating a piece of apple pie with a fork, reading a back issue of Progressive Farmer. Carl slid into the booth across from him without asking. There was something in the day that had used up his social formalities. Silas looked up from the magazine. He waited. "I was just by your place," Carl said. Silas put down the magazine. "Your corn looks good," Carl said. Silas picked up his fork. "It'll do," he said. Carl put his coffee down and looked at his hands. He was 51 years old and had spent 30 years in agricultural finance, and he was having a feeling he hadn't expected to have today, which was something close to grief. Not for his bank, not exactly, but for something larger and less definable. For all the men on his list who had done everything the university and the extension service and the secretary of agriculture and the commodity broker and the implement dealer and, yes, the bank itself had told them to do. Who had worked themselves into the ground and borrowed themselves into ruin, doing exactly what the entire institutional apparatus of American agriculture had told them was the only intelligent, modern, profitable course. Who had gotten big, as instructed. Who were now getting out, not by choice. "Silas," he said, "when did you know it was going to be a dry year?" Silas cut a piece of pie crust and ate it and chewed thoughtfully. "February," he said. "How'd you know in February?" Silas considered the question. He looked out the window at the main street of Keene Falls, at the empty parking spaces in front of the farm implement dealer, who had closed his showroom floor for the season because there was nobody buying, at the grain elevator that would be processing a fraction of its normal volume this year, at the hardware store whose front window bore a paper sign reading "Going out of business. All stock reduced." He looked at all of this and then looked back at Carl. "My father taught me to read the January sky," he said, "and the snowpack in the western draws, and the way the ground feels in March when you put a probe down." He paused. "And the almanac." Carl almost laughed, not at Silas, but at the whole improbable situation. "The almanac," he said. "It's right more often than people give it credit for." They sat for a moment in the particular silence of a diner in a small town at the end of a bad summer. Outside, one of Gordon Weaver's trucks went by slowly, loaded with equipment, heading toward the auction barn south of town. "He's going to lose everything, isn't he?" Silas said. It was not quite a question. "He's going to lose a great deal of it," Carl said. Silas nodded slowly. There was no satisfaction in the nod. None of the vindicating, told-you-so quality that the moment might have warranted in a lesser man. It was the same nod he gave the sky when it confirmed what he'd expected of it. A simple, unembellished acknowledgement of what was. "I'm sorry for him," Silas said. Carl looked at him. "Are you?" "He worked hard," Silas said. "He wasn't lazy or foolish. He was doing what everyone told him to do." He put $1.02 on the table and picked up his magazine. "That's almost worse." He walked out of the diner, and Carl sat with his coffee, and for a long time he didn't pick it up. The last week of August, a reporter came to Harlan County from the Omaha World-Herald to write about the drought. She was 26 years old, named Karen Byfield, and she had been assigned the story because her editor thought it would benefit from a human interest angle alongside the market reports and the insurance claim statistics. She drove County Road 14 with a camera bag on the passenger seat, looking for pictures. What she found was an entire valley the color of ash. The corn that hadn't been irrigated, the dryland fields, the smaller operations that had planted their ground in spring and prayed for rain that never came, had given up in June and stood as a kind of scarecrow army, dead on their feet. The irrigated fields were better, but as she drove further east, even the pivot-irrigated fields looked wrong. Too brown at the edges where the circles didn't reach, and inside the circles the corn was alive but stressed, hanging on rather than thriving. She stopped at several farms and talked to farmers, and the farmers were polite. This was Nebraska, but there was a weight behind their eyes that she recognized from other assignments. It was the weight of people who had worked hard and were watching the results of that work unmade by forces they could neither understand nor resist. At one farm, she photographed a center pivot system with no water coming from its sprinkler heads, standing in a field of dead corn. The great technological arm frozen in its arc, useless, surrounded by catastrophe. It had the quality of an emblem, and she knew it was the photograph she'd come for. Then she drove further east and found something she hadn't expected. She almost drove past it. The change in color was subtle at first. You had to be looking for it, or perhaps looking in a certain frame of mind, open to the possibility that anything alive was still out here. But as she slowed down, she could see that the corn on the right side of the road was not the same as the corn she'd been passing for 20 miles. It was shorter than the hybrid varieties, less uniform, and if you'd only ever seen the big commercial fields you might have thought there was something wrong with it. But it was green. Genuinely, unmistakably green. She pulled over and got out with her camera. The windmill was turning. She could hear it from the road, that slow, ancient sound that she recognized from childhood visits to her grandmother's farm in Iowa, as the sound of water. And behind it, the farmhouse with its white paint going gray in places, and the cottonwood windbreak dark against the pale sky, and the small herd of black cattle in the pasture moving toward the stock tank, and the whole quiet scene with the quality of something very old and very unhurried that no catastrophe had managed to interrupt. She photographed the windmill for 15 minutes, moving around it, getting the low angle that showed it against the bleached sky with the dead corn horizon in the background. Then she went to the house and knocked. Silas Holt answered the door in his chambray shirt, his cat cap, his suspenders. He looked at her for a moment with the measuring quality of a man who spends a good deal of time alone. "Can I help you?" She explained who she was and why she was there. He looked past her at the fields for a moment. Then he said, "Come around back." They sat at a picnic table behind the house, under the shade of an old silver maple whose roots had been drinking from the same buried clay pipe as the garden for 40 years, and he answered her questions in the direct, spare way that was his nature. He did not editorialize or perform modesty. When she asked about the windmill, he told her about his father putting it up. When she asked about the corn variety, he described it without sentimentality, but with a kind of deep familiarity, the way you'd describe a member of your family. When she asked why he hadn't expanded or modernized the way his neighbors had, he thought for a while. I didn't want to own more than I could pay back in a bad year, he said. Because bad years come. When she asked about Gordon Weaver, tactfully, obliquely, he looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. He was a good farmer, he said finally. Better than me in a good year, by a long measure. Don't print anything that makes him sound foolish. She wrote it down anyway, because she was 26 and still believed that the truth was its own justification, and because what Silas had said, don't print anything that makes him sound foolish, was itself the character portrait the story required. The piece ran on the front page of the World Herald the following Sunday, under the headline, The Last Green Farm. The photograph of the Aermotor Windmill turning against the white-blue drought sky, with Silas's corn in the foreground and the dead horizon behind, was picked up by the Associated Press and ran in several hundred papers across the country. The editors in New York who selected it for their front pages found it a perfect symbol, old technology, still turning, old ways, still working, and used it with the unself-conscious confidence of people who know a good image when they see one. Silas did not keep a copy. His daughter mailed him one from Lincoln, and he put it in a drawer. September came, and the days shortened, and the nights cooled, and the corn dried. In the valley, there was little to harvest. The Weaver operation sent its hired men through what remained of the crops in late September. The deepest wells had kept some ground alive in patches, and the combine that rolled through Gordon's best remaining field averaged 38 bushels per acre, compared to his 10-year average of 212. Across the county, crop insurance adjusters were on every farm, filling out their forms in the kitchen tables of houses where the mood was the specific gray of people who have spent all summer watching something die and are now being asked to put a number on it. The First Agricultural Bank of Keene Falls issued foreclosure proceedings in October against 7 operations in Harlan County, including the Weaver Farm. Gordon was given 60 days to vacate the main residence. The land would go to a combination of creditors and the FDIC, which had taken over the bank's troubled agricultural portfolio as part of the savings and loan crisis that was, in 1988, claiming financial institutions across the rural Midwest like a grass fire moving through a dry September pasture. Gordon Weaver moved his family to North Platte, where his wife had family. His John Deere 4640, the big tractor he'd bought as an act of faith in the efficiency of the new, sold at auction for 68 cents on the dollar. The center pivot systems were sold to an equipment dealer from Iowa who shipped them to farms in better water country. The 5 irrigation wells were capped. The farmland was absorbed into a portfolio of distressed agricultural assets held by a trust that had no name you could attach a face to and no address you could drive to in a truck. On a Saturday in late October, driving through the valley on his way somewhere he didn't much want to go, Gordon turned down County Road 14. He drove the full length of it. He drove past the Kester place, which was empty, the windows reflecting nothing, past the Strickland ground, already wearing the look of vacancy, past what had been the Lundgren farm, where he'd bought that last 800 acres in 1983 with so much confidence, and past the small Hendricks operation that had also gone under, its yard now collecting the blown leaves of a fall that nobody was there to rake. At the end of the road, he stopped. Silas Holt's fields were brown now, the corn cut and the stalks standing in neat rows of stubble, but there was something in the way the ground lay that was different from the ground on the other side of the fence. It was a fullness, a completeness, the look of ground that had been treated with a respect that had accumulated over decades and was visible, somehow, in the way the stubble stood, in the color of the soil between the rows, in a quality of patience and readiness that the other fields did not have. The stubble was there for a reason, to hold the ground through the winter, to catch the snow, to decompose and give back what it had taken. It was not the end of the year's work. It was the beginning of next year's. The windmill was turning in the October wind, a brisk northwest now, and from where he sat in his truck, Gordon could hear it. That sound. He had heard it his whole adult life, the slow creak and turn of the old wheel, and he had always found it vaguely amusing, the sound of something outdated and inefficient, a relic that stubbornness and sentiment had kept operating past its time. He was hearing it differently now. He could not have said exactly what the difference was. It was not dramatic enough to be called a revelation, and he was not a dramatic man. But the sound of the windmill turning in the empty autumn valley had a quality he had not attributed to it before, and he sat with it for a while without moving, the truck idling, his hands in his lap. Then he drove on. In the spring of 1989, the rains returned. Not all at once, and not in a manner that undid the damage of the previous year. Nothing does that, but steadily, in the right amounts, at the right times. The Republican River ran full for the first time in 2 seasons. The shallow aquifer in the valley began a slow recharge that the hydrologists said would take 3 to 5 years to complete. On Silas Holt's 160 acres, the land was ready to receive it. He had overwintered his fallow fields with a cover of annual rye that had caught the snow and held it against the ground. And when the snow melted in March, it went down, not off the side of the field, not into the roadside ditch, but down into the soil profile, down toward the roots of next year's corn, down toward the deep clay layer where it would stay until summer needed it. He had spread a thin layer of cattle manure on the east field in November, turning the cows' winter bedding into soil amendment the way his father had done and his grandfather before that. He had checked his windmill in early March and found that after 51 years of service, the main shaft bearing needed replacement. A 3-hour job with parts from the farm supply store in Keene Falls, $37, and he had replaced it on a cold morning, working alone on top of the tower in the wind, with the same unhurried competence with which he did everything. He planted in April. Holt Flint, selected from his best ears of 1,988 drought survivors, every one of them, plants that had proved their capacity to endure the worst the sky could offer and still make corn. There was a kind of natural selection in what he was doing, though he would not have used that language. He knew only that the seed he was saving was getting better at being itself, more tenacious, more self-reliant, more deeply adapted to this particular piece of ground in this particular valley. Every year of saving the best and planting it again was a year of accumulated wisdom stored in a kernel of corn. The Pioneer hybrid seed catalog reset itself annually, bred for average conditions, optimized for the entire system. The trucks, the fertilizer, the electricity, the pivots. Holt Flint was optimized for Silas's farm, by Silas's farm, over 70 years of quiet and patient collaboration between a family and its ground. The County Extension Service, in the years following the 1988 drought, added a new bulletin to its annual publication series, a guide to drought-resilient farming practices, incorporating material on deep-rooted traditional varieties, conservative plant populations, crop rotation, cover cropping, and reduced reliance on continuous irrigation. Brad Kowalski, who had returned to Lincoln after his Harlan County posting, was listed in the acknowledgments as a contributor. He had spent a fair amount of time in his office in the years since 1985 thinking about the conversation he'd had with Silas in the seed corn shed, and about the specific contrast between what the Extension Service had been recommending for 20 years and what had actually survived the summer of 1988. The bulletin did not mention Silas Holt by name, but the farmers who read it, and who had known the valley in 1988, knew where the ideas had come from. In the summer of 1991, Silas's granddaughter Jennifer, 22, fresh from 2 years of agriculture studies at Nebraska State, came to spend the summer at the farm. She was smart and eager and had been shaped by her courses into someone who said words like sustainable and systems-based approach and integrated nutrient management, and who had a clipboard and a genuine desire to understand things. Silas watched her for the first week with a quiet amusement, and then, as she settled into the rhythms of the farm, with something warmer. She wanted to understand the windmill. He took her up the tower on a Tuesday morning, showing her where to put her hands, where to step, the same way his father had shown him half a century before, and at the top they sat on the platform, and he explained the mechanics. The sail wheel and how it turned into the wind with the tail vane. The gearbox that converted the rotary motion of the wheel into the reciprocating motion of the sucker rod. The sucker rod that ran down through the center of the tower, 80 feet, into the well casing, working the cylinder pump at the bottom. Every time the wheel made a full turn, the rod made one stroke, and one stroke lifted water. That was the whole of it. The wind turned the wheel worked the rod lifted the water. No electric bill, no circuit board, No software update, no insurance claim. It's beautiful, Jennifer said, looking up at the wheel turning above them, the sky beyond it pale with early summer heat. It works, Silas said. She looked at him, and she smiled, because she was young and still had the luxury of responding to beauty as beauty. And then she thought about the distinction he was making, and she looked at the wheel again with different eyes. I think those might be the same thing, she said. He thought about that for a while, sitting on the platform with the wind moving through the slats around them and the water rising quietly somewhere below their feet. Could be, he said. The 1937 Aermotor is still turning today. The Holt farm, 160 acres of the same ground that Clarence Holt broke with a walking plow in 1902, has never been foreclosed upon. It has never been sold out of the family. It has never been parceled, subdivided, or absorbed by a corporate agriculture operation. Its ground has never been strip mined for aquifer water beyond its means to replenish. Its corn, a variety you will find in no commercial seed catalog, carrying no registered trademark and no university test plot data, has been planted and harvested and replanted for going on 90 years. It has been through droughts and floods and early frosts and commodity crashes and world wars and the particular American catastrophe of the 1980s farm crisis. And it has come through all of them the way things come through when they are rooted in something true and old and not borrowed. The valley has changed around it. The great pivot systems that once dominated the landscape have been modified, reduced, or removed. The farmland that the bank held after 1988 has gone through several corporate hands and is now managed by an agricultural investment trust that plants GMO soybeans on a 2-year rotation with winter wheat, and which generates a consistent, if undramatic, return, and which has hired one part-time manager to oversee 2,400 acres of ground that no single family remembers anymore. The aquifer is recovering. Slowly. The Aermotor turns on its tower through the seasons, through the hot still days of August and the northwest gales of November and the ice storms of January, when the wheel feathers out of the wind to keep from running too fast. It turns in the small hours of the night when there is no one to hear it, lifting water from the darkness below into the darkness above, filling the tank, letting the overflow run down the familiar clay pipe toward the roots of whatever is growing. It has been doing this since Franklin Roosevelt was in his second term, since the year Seabiscuit ran at Santa Anita, since the last year before the Second World War began to cast its shadow over the flat American landscape. It has asked nothing from the power grid and paid nothing to the electric company and required no circuit breaker and filed no insurance claim. It has outlasted every subsidy program and every market collapse and every technological revolution that the agricultural establishment has cycled through in 50 years of enthusiastic improvement. It knows, if a machine can be said to know anything, only one thing: that the wind keeps coming, that the water is down there, that doing this simple work, day after day, year after year, through the droughts and the good years and the catastrophes and the recoveries, doing it steadily, modestly, without drama or ambition or any particular desire to be noticed, is enough, more than enough. It is everything.